She found him standing in the doorway. That was the part Ellen Hawkins had not expected. She had expected the lantern light, the smell of carbolic soap and dried herbs, the rattling breath of a man fighting fever in the dark. She had expected the four walls of the sickroom she had been summoned to tend, the narrow cot, the basin of water she had been refreshing 3 times a day for 11 days straight. What she had not expected, what stopped the breath clean out of her lungs and made her grip the door frame with both hands, was Albert Holloway standing upright in the threshold of that same sickroom at midnight, wearing nothing but his trousers and a week's worth of dark stubble, staring at her as though she were the ghost and he were the man who had always belonged to this world. His eyes held something that terrified her more than any gunshot wound, more than any rattling, desperate fever she had nursed. They held recognition, not the bleary, unfocused recognition of a man half lost to illness. Clear, sharp, settled recognition, the kind that comes when a person has been lying still long enough to think through everything and has arrived at a conclusion he cannot walk back from. "You should be in bed," she said, because those were the only words she could trust herself to produce. "I have been in bed for 11 days, he said, and his voice was rough from disuse, rough in a way that moved through her like a low chord struck on a fiddle. "I think that is sufficient." Ellen released the door frame. She straightened her back. She had not come to this ranch to feel anything for any man. She had come because a stranger was dying and no one else in Caldwell County, Kansas, in the autumn of 1882, had been willing to make the ride out to the Holloway place. She had come with her medical bag and her reasons and her carefully constructed walls, and she had spent 11 days behind those walls. But the walls had a crack in them now, and his name was Albert Holloway, and he was standing in her doorway looking at her like she was the only fixed point in a world that had been spinning off its axis. "You are going to open that wound," she said. "Probably," he agreed. Neither of them moved, and that was the moment that everything began. 3 weeks earlier, Ellen Hawkins had been sitting at the counter of Dawson's General Store in the town of Harlo, Kansas, writing a letter she wasn't sure she would ever send. The letter was addressed to her sister Clara in Cincinnati, and it was the kind of letter a woman writes when she is trying to convince herself that the choices she has made were the right ones. Ellen was 28 years old, which in 1882 was the age at which a woman was expected to have resolved herself into some fixed shape, married or widowed, or settled into useful spinsterhood. Ellen had resolved herself into none of those shapes. She had trained under Dr. Horace Pemberton in Wichita for 4 years before Pemberton died of typhus, which struck Ellen as a profound injustice, and she had been practicing what she privately called medicine, and what the men of Harlo privately called nursing, which was their way of keeping the world orderly and familiar. She was good at it. She was exceptionally good at it, in the way that people are good at things they have chosen rather than things they have been handed. She had steady hands and a calm voice and a quality of attention that made sick people feel, for the first time in their illness, that someone was truly present with them. She had delivered 17 babies, set 43 broken bones, treated more cases of prairie fever than she could count, and saved the life of a man who had been shot through the shoulder in a dispute over a fence line. What she had not done was let any of it touch her. That was her hidden motive, the secret architecture of her days. Stay useful. Stay moving. Don't stay anywhere long enough to root. She had been in Harlo 14 months, which was already longer than she intended. The letter arrived on a Wednesday. Not her letter to Clara, but a different one, delivered by a boy on a chestnut horse who looked like he'd ridden hard and was proud of it. The boy handed the letter to Martin Dawson behind the counter, who handed it to Ellen, because everyone in Harlo understood that if someone needed medical help, the message went to Ellen Hawkins first. The letter was 3 lines long. It was written in a large, uneven hand that suggested the writer was either uneducated or had written it in haste or both. It said, "Man badly hurt at the Holloway Ranch, 12 miles east on the Creek Road. Can't bring him to town, won't last." It was signed only with the letter W. Ellen folded the letter. She folded her unfinished letter to Clara. She put both in her coat pocket, picked up her medical bag, and walked out to where the Dawson boy had tied her mare. "Do you know the Holloway ranch?" she asked. The boy, who was perhaps 14 and delighted to be useful, said he did, that it was the big spread past the second fork on the creek road, that everyone knew Albert Holloway on account of his cattle operation being the largest in the county, and that the general opinion in town was that whatever had happened to whoever was hurt out there was probably Albert Holloway's fault because Albert Holloway was that kind of man. "What kind of man?" Ellen asked. The boy thought about it. "The kind that makes things happen," he said finally, as though this were a moral failing. Ellen mounted her mare and rode east. The creek road in October was a corridor of cottonwood and ash, the leaves gone yellow and orange and brown, the sky above them the particular deep blue of Kansas autumn that always surprised her no matter how many autumns she spent beneath it. The 12 miles took her an hour and a half, because she stopped twice to check her bearings, and once because a family of white-tailed deer crossed the road ahead of her with that dreamy, unhurried confidence that deer have when they believe the world belongs to them. The Holloway ranch was not what she had expected. She had built a picture in her mind of a rough outfit, the kind of place where a man who made things happen might run his operation, functional, spare, indifferent to beauty. What she found instead was a house that had clearly been built in stages, the original structure of sawn lumber expanded twice by additions, with a covered porch running its full length and a kitchen garden at the side that had been well maintained right up until sometime in the past few weeks, when it had begun to go to seed in the way that gardens do when their keeper has stopped being able to tend them. There were flowers, dried and browning now but clearly intentional, planted along the front of the porch. Someone had cared about this place. Someone had planted flowers. A man was waiting for her at the gate. He was somewhere in his 50s with a weathered brown face and close-cropped white hair and the kind of compact, contained authority that Ellen associated with men who had spent their lives being competent in difficult circumstances. He introduced himself as Willis, which explained the W on the letter. "Is it the rancher?" Ellen asked, already walking toward the house. "Yes, ma'am, Mr. Holloway. He took a fall from a horse 3 days back, and the wound in his side got infected. I've been keeping him clean and cool as I can, but the fever's been climbing since yesterday." Willis held the door open for her. "He's a hard man to keep still." "They always are," Ellen said. She had expected a stranger. Albert Holloway at his worst, flat on a sickroom cot with fever burning through him and 3 days of accumulated suffering pulling at his face, was still a man who commanded attention. He was perhaps 35, she judged, which meant he had built a cattle operation of this size starting young. He was long-limbed and broad-shouldered in the way of men who have done hard physical work their entire lives, and even in the distortion of fever, his face had a quality of structure and intelligence that made her stop for just a moment before she pulled her professional calm around her like a coat. He was not conscious when she arrived. That was a mercy for both of them, she decided later, because it gave her time to assess the wound, to clean it, to begin the treatment that would take him through the worst of the fever and out the other side, without having to manage his personality at the same time. The wound was a deep laceration along his left side, probably from the edge of a saddle horn when the horse threw him, and it had developed the kind of infection that announced itself loudly. The skin around it was hot and dark, and the smell told her it had been festering for at least 2 days before Willis's letter reached her. She cleaned it with carbolic solution, which she carried in her medical bag alongside her scalpel, her forceps, her laudanum, and the dried herbs she had been using since her training with Dr. Pemberton. She packed it with clean cloth and told Willis to boil the water he used for anything touching the wound. Then she sat down beside the cot to wait. That was the part people did not understand about the work she did. The treating was the quick part. The waiting was the work. Fever like this required management, not miracles. Cool cloths, hydration when she could get it into him, watching the wound for changes, watching his breathing, watching his color, staying present with a certainty that whatever happened next, she would be ready for it. She had not planned to stay the night. By morning, she understood that leaving was not a responsible option. By the second day, she had sent Willis to town with a note for Martin Dawson explaining that she was detained. By the third day, she had found the small bedroom off the back of the house that Willis said had been meant for the housekeeper who never materialized, and she had made it her own in the minimal way she always made spaces her own, placing her bag by the door and her personal kit on the windowsill and nothing else. She told herself it was a medical case. She told herself it was professional obligation. She told herself these things with increasing frequency as the days passed. On the fourth day, Albert Holloway opened his eyes. He was still deep in fever, still not entirely present, but his eyes tracked to her face when she leaned over him with the cloth, and they stayed there. She watched him try to form words and fail, watched him try again. "Who?" he managed. "Ellen Hawkins," she said. "I'm the nurse from Harlo. You're going to be all right. Lie still." He appeared to consider this information. Then his eyes closed again, and he slept, and she sat back in her chair and pressed her hands flat against her knees to stop them from trembling, which was not a reaction she had ever had to a patient opening his eyes before, and which she found entirely unacceptable. On the fifth day, he was more lucid, and she made the mistake of asking him whether he had any family she should contact. He turned his head on the pillow and looked at her with an expression that she would come to know very well over the following weeks, an expression that combined complete honesty with a complete absence of self-pity, and said that his wife had died of fever 4 years ago and his parents were dead, and his brother had moved to Colorado and they hadn't spoken in 2 years. And no, there was no one to contact. Ellen wrote down none of this. She filed it in the part of herself that she kept locked, where things went that she was not prepared to examine yet. "What about you?" he asked. "I am your nurse," she said. "That is the only relevant information right now." He accepted this with more grace than she expected. On the 6th day the fever broke. She was sitting beside him when it happened, watching the fine trembling that had run through him for the past 48 hours finally, slowly, settle into stillness. His breathing deepened. His color shifted from that terrible grayish flush of fever back toward something that looked like skin again. She pressed 2 fingers to the pulse at his wrist and felt it even out from the rapid, shallow flutter of illness to something steadier and more certain. She sat there for a long moment with her fingers on his wrist, not because she needed to take his pulse anymore, but because she had forgotten to let go. She let go. She stood up. She walked to the kitchen where Willis was drinking coffee and watching her with the steady, knowing patience of a man who has worked for the same family for decades and has seen a great many things come and go. "Fever broke," she said. "Yes, ma'am," said Willis, in a tone that made her suspect he was not entirely talking about the fever. The days that followed were the days of recovery, which were in some ways harder than the days of crisis. In crisis, there is only the work. In recovery, there is time, there is conversation. There are long afternoon hours when the light comes through the window of the sickroom at an angle that makes everything gold and still, and the patient is well enough to talk but not well enough to do anything else, and the nurse is sitting 3 feet away with her hands occupied by mending or reading or nothing at all. Albert Holloway, it turned out, was a man who had a great many thoughts and very few people to share them with. He had been running this ranch alone for 4 years, since his wife Sarah's death, with only Willis and the rotating cast of hired hands that any cattle operation required. He had not been, by his own description, good company to himself. He talked about the ranch first, because that was safe. He had built it from 400 acres and 150 head of cattle into a 2,000-acre operation with over 800 head. And he talked about it with the restrained pride of a man who knows the difference between what he has accomplished and what the land itself has allowed. He talked about the creek that ran through the south pasture, and how it had been the deciding factor when he chose this land at 23 years old, with everything he owned loaded into a wagon. He talked about the drought of 1879 and how he had nearly lost everything, and the way he described it without drama, just as a sequence of problems he had solved one at a time, told Ellen more about his character than any direct statement could. On the 8th day he asked her where she had come from. "Cincinnati originally," she said. "Long way," he said. "Most distances are," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "What brought you out here?" She gave him the version she always gave, which was true as far as it went. She had trained under Dr. Pemberton, and after Pemberton died, she had found there was more need for her skills on the frontier than in any city, and she had followed that need. It was all true. It was also the version that left out the part where she had been engaged, briefly, to a man named Robert Farrell in Cincinnati. And Robert Farrell had turned out to be the kind of man who wanted a woman to be a version of himself that he could control. And when he discovered that Ellen was not that kind of woman, he had demonstrated this want with the kind of controlling behavior that left marks. She had left before the marks became permanent. She had come west because west was direction, and direction was the thing she needed most when everything behind her felt like a trap. She did not tell Albert Holloway any of that. Not on the 8th day. But she noticed, on the 8th day, that he listened to the version she gave him with the same quality of attention she gave to her patients, the kind of listening that goes deeper than the words and waits patiently for whatever the words are protecting. On the 9th day, she found Sarah Holloway's portrait. She had not been exploring. She had been looking for an extra blanket in the hall chest, and the chest drawer stuck, and when she pulled it harder it came all the way out. And behind it, where it had apparently slid and been forgotten, was a small framed photograph. It was a woman perhaps 30 years old, dark-haired and dark-eyed and beautiful in a direct, forthright way, looking at the camera with the unself-conscious confidence of someone who was comfortable being looked at. On the back of the frame, in pencil, Sarah. March 1877. Ellen put the portrait carefully back where she had found it. She replaced the drawer. She stood there in the hallway for a long moment with her hand flat against the wall. She was not jealous. She was not so far gone that she was jealous of a dead woman. What she felt was something more complicated, a kind of tenderness toward the loss that had shaped the man in the sickroom, and a kind of grief for Sarah Holloway, who had planted flowers along the porch and would have gone on planting them if fever hadn't taken her at what appeared to be 30 years old, and a quiet, uncomfortable recognition that the reason she was standing here with her hand against the wall was that Albert Holloway had become, without her noticing, someone she thought about. That was the 10th day. On the 10th day she was more careful, she was professional. She maintained the correct distance. She spoke only about medical matters and practical household ones, checked his wound, which was healing cleanly now, changed the dressing, pronounced him improving, and spent the afternoon in the kitchen helping Willis make bread because it was something to do with her hands. Willis watched her knead the bread dough with the same steady patience he watched everything. "He's a good man," Willis said. "I'm sure he is," Ellen said. "He doesn't say much about himself. But he's a good man." "Willis," Ellen said, not unkindly, "I am going to go home to Harlo when he is well enough to manage without nursing. That is what is going to happen." Willis considered this. "Yes, ma'am," he said. On the 11th night she couldn't sleep. This was not unusual. She often couldn't sleep in the middle of a case, the vigilant part of her brain refusing to stand down entirely. She rose at midnight, put on her robe, and went to check on her patient out of habit. The sickroom was empty. The bed was unmade, the impression of him still in the pillow, and for one wild, disorienting moment her heart seized with something that she would have described, if pressed, as pure panic. And then she turned, and there he was, standing in the doorway of the sickroom that opened onto the hall. Standing upright, both feet on the floor, one hand braced lightly against the door frame more for balance than support, looking at her. "You should be in bed," she said. "I have been in bed for 11 days, he said. "I think that is sufficient." In the lamplight from the hall, His face was all shadow and gold, the fever entirely gone from it now, replaced by something that was just himself, clear and present, and looking at her with that quality of attention that she had come to recognize as distinctly his. That particular way he had of looking that made her feel as though she were the most interesting thing in the room, not because she was performing, but because she was there. "You are going to open that wound," she said again. "You've been saying that for 4 days," he said. "It has been a relevant concern for 4 days. Is it still a concern?" She crossed to him before she made the conscious decision to cross to him, came close enough to put her hand against his side, pressing gently over the location of the wound through the fabric of his shirt. She could feel the heat of him, the heat of a man recovered from illness, just normal warmth now, living warmth. She pressed carefully, assessing. He held very still. "It seems intact," she said, and did not move her hand. "Ellen," he said. It was the first time he had used her name without the miss preceding it, and it landed in her chest like something dropped from a height, deep and unavoidable. "I am still your nurse," she said, but her voice had lost some of its professional steadiness. "The fever's been gone for 5 days," he said. "At some point I'm just a man." She took her hand back. She took a step back. She looked at him in the doorway. This man she had come to nurse in his illness, and had somehow remained with into his recovery. This man who had told her about his ranch and his drought and his dead wife with the same unshrinking honesty. This man who listened to her the way she listened to the sick, all the way down. "Albert," she said, and it was the first time she had used his name without the Mr. either, and she watched the slight shift in his expression when she did it, barely perceptible, but she had been looking at his face for 11 days and she caught it. "I am going back to Harlo when you are well." "I know," he said. "I've told you that." "You've told me that," he agreed. "You've also been here 11 days, and you've been awake at midnight checking on me, and your hand is still warm from where you had it on my side." Ellen looked at her own hand as if it had betrayed her, which it had. "Go back to bed," she said. "All right," he said. But he didn't move for a moment, not right away. And in that moment the lamplight held them both in a circle of gold in the dark hallway of his house, and the distance between them was exactly the distance she had been carefully maintaining for 11 days, and she was suddenly, entirely conscious of every inch of it. Then he nodded once like a man honoring an agreement and turned back into the sickroom, and she stood in the hallway alone with her hands still warm and her heart making sounds it was not supposed to make. She went back to her room. She sat on the edge of her bed. She did not sleep for another 2 hours. In the morning she was crisp and professional and spoke only about the wound dressing and his need to continue resting. And Albert Holloway watched her with those clear eyes and said yes ma'am to everything she told him. And if there was a slight, contained amusement in the yes ma'am, she decided not to acknowledge it. Willis made breakfast. She sat at the kitchen table and Albert sat across from her, which was the first morning he had been well enough to sit at a table, and Willis put plates of eggs and salt pork and biscuits in front of them and then very deliberately found reasons to be in other parts of the house. "This is good land," Albert said. He was looking out the kitchen window at the pasture, where the morning light was running gold through the yellow grass. "People think Kansas is just flat empty nothing, but it isn't." "It's full." "Full of what?" she asked. He thought about it with that seriousness he brought to things. "Space," he said finally. "Real space. Not the crowded kind where you're pressed up against everyone else's life all the time. Out here you can hear yourself think. I needed that after," he paused. "After some things." She did not ask what things. She understood. Dark pasts had a way of driving people toward space. "I grew up surrounded by people," she said, and then wondered why she had said it since she had been trying not to volunteer personal information. 8 children in a 3-room house in Cincinnati. "I used to climb out the window at night and sit on the roof so I could have a single thought to myself." He looked at her. "What did you think about up there?" "Anything," she said. "Everything. It didn't matter." "What mattered was the thinking itself." He nodded slowly. "I had a tree," he said, Big oak behind my father's house in Missouri. I used to go up there when everything got to be too much. That's how I ended up ranching, I think. I kept looking for the version of that oak tree that was big enough to hold an adult. Ellen Hawkins was quiet for a moment, looking at her plate. The eggs were going cold and she didn't care. "Did you find it?" she asked. "Parts of it," he said. He glanced out at the land again, working on the rest. She looked up and found him looking at her, not at the land, and the air between them had that quality of stillness that comes just before something shifts, the held breath of a moment on the edge of itself. She picked up her fork. "You should eat," she said. "You need the protein for healing." "Yes, ma'am," he said, and the amusement was back in it, warm and not unkind. The next few days settled into a rhythm that she recognized was dangerous precisely because it was comfortable. She checked his wound each morning. He was up and moving now, slowly and carefully, and she watched him fight his own impatience with the limitations of a body still repairing itself. Watched him direct Willis from the porch when he couldn't yet go to the pasture himself. Watched him absorb the report of a section of fence down on the east boundary with the same calm problem-solving focus he applied to everything. She helped where she was useful. She found the kitchen garden and began pulling the things that had died from neglect and leaving the ones that could still be saved. It gave her something to do. It was not her garden. She told herself this firmly every morning when she went out to it with her gloves on. He watched her from the porch. "Sarah planted those," he said one afternoon. Ellen straightened up. She turned to look at him. "I can leave them," she said. "No," he said. He said it quietly, without drama. "It's good that someone is tending them." She held his gaze for a moment. "Tell me about her," she said, because instinct told her that the thing he needed, the thing that was still caught in him like a splinter, was not to be handled delicately around but directly. She had learned this about grief in the people she nursed. It did not go away when you walked around it. It went quiet when you walked toward it. He was quiet for a moment. Then he sat down in the porch chair, and she came to the porch steps and sat on the top one, and he told her. Sarah had been from Missouri also. They had met at a church social when Albert was 20 and she was 19, and they had both, he said with a slight smile, been standing at the refreshments table calculating how quickly they could leave. They had started talking and stayed until they were the last two people there. He had proposed 6 months later. They had come west together 4 years after that, when Albert's father's land had been sold out from under the family, and the west was where the future seemed to be. Sarah had been the gardener. She had also been the one who insisted on the flowers along the porch, who had made curtains for the windows out of flour sacks dyed blue, who had held the enterprise of the ranch together on the human side while Albert built its physical and financial structure. She had died in March of 1878, 4 years into their life on the ranch, taken by a fever that came fast and did not offer negotiation. Albert had been with her. He did not describe those last days in detail, but the way he did not describe them told Ellen everything she needed to know. "For years," he said, "and I haven't taken the curtains down." Ellen looked through the kitchen window at the faded blue flour sack curtains. "Why would you?" she said. He looked at her. "Some people have suggested it would be moving on." "Moving on is not the same as erasing," she said. "Anyone who suggests otherwise has likely not lost anyone they loved." He was quiet for a long moment. "You have," he said. It was not a question. Ellen looked out at the garden. "My mother," she said, "when I was 16, and my father before that. I'm sorry. It was a long time ago, but you don't forget. You just learn to carry it differently." He nodded. "I'm still learning that part," he said. "You're doing all right," she said, and meant it, and felt the shift in the air again, and this time neither of them looked away from it. "Ellen," he said. "Don't," she said, but gently. "I'm not going to say anything that oversteps." "I know," she said. "I just need you to not say it yet." He nodded. He accepted this. He picked up the cup of coffee Willis had brought him and looked out at his land, and she sat on the porch step in the October sun and thought about a hidden motive she had been carrying for weeks without acknowledging it. The reason she had found reasons to stay. The reason the kitchen garden had gotten tended, and the bread had gotten baked, and the mornings at the kitchen table had stopped feeling like professional maintenance and started feeling like the most real part of her day. She was afraid. That was the honest truth of it. She had come here a woman who did not stay. She had constructed her life out of movement because movement felt like safety, because Robert Farrell had taught her what happened when you stayed and trusted and gave someone your fixed, rooted self. The trap of that. The way love could be used as a mechanism of control when the wrong person held it. Albert Holloway was not Robert Farrell. She knew this in her bones. But the bones remembered the old fear, even when the mind had moved past it. And she was sitting on this porch 3 days past any reasonable medical need to be here. And she needed to make a decision. That evening she told Willis she would be leaving the following morning. Willis said yes, ma'am, and said he would have her horse ready. She went to find Albert. He was in the barn, doing something careful and slow with a harness that needed mending, sitting on a hay bale with his long legs stretched out and his attention on the leather and the stitching. And the lamplight in the barn was warmer than the lamplight in the house, and he looked up when she came in, and the expression on his face was the clear, direct one that always undid her a little. "I'm leaving tomorrow," she said. "All right," he said. "You're well enough. The wound is closed and clean, your strength is coming back. Willis can manage any further care." "I know," he said. "I have patients in Harlo who need me." "I know that too." She stood there in the barn doorway, and he sat on the hay bale looking at her, and the horse in the nearest stall made a patient shifting sound. "I don't know what I'm doing," she said finally, because she was too tired for careful construction. "Yes, you do," he said. "You're scared." She opened her mouth to dispute this and closed it again. "You don't know that," she said, but without conviction. "I know what scared looks like," he said. "I see it in the mirror. I've been scared of this for 12 days. He set the harness down. He looked at her steadily. "Ellen, I'm not asking you to stay. I know you need to go back to Harlo. I know you have work and a life and reasons I don't know all of. All I'm asking is," he paused. He was careful with his words the way a man is careful when the words matter. "Would you let me come to see you? In town? Properly? With the full understanding that you owe me nothing and the full right to send me away if that's what you want?" She stood in the barn doorway for a long moment. "Why?" she asked. "Because I think you're worth the ride," he said. Ellen Hawkins had been told by men that she was beautiful, that she was accomplished, that she was useful, that she was a credit to her sex, that she would make a good wife if she could manage to be a little less formidable. No one had ever told her she was worth the ride. It was such a plain, practical Albert Holloway way of saying what he meant that it caught her entirely off guard, and she laughed. A real laugh, the first one she had let herself have in weeks, and it ran through the barn, and the horse shifted again approvingly. "All right," she said. "You can come to town. Next week." "Next week is fine," she said. She rode back to Harlo the next morning with her medical bag across her saddle, and the October sky burning blue and cold above her, and she did not look back at the ranch house or the porch or the kitchen garden, and she told herself very firmly for the entire 12 miles that this was not the beginning of something. She did not believe herself for a single step of it. He came on Saturday. He rode into Harlo on a big gray horse at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, having clearly made an effort. Clean shirt, clean shave, his dark hair brushed back, his hat in his hand as he knocked on the door of the room she kept above Dawson's store. She opened the door and found him standing there with a bunch of late wild asters he had clearly cut from somewhere along the creek road, purple and yellow and already a little drooping from the ride. And the expression on his face was a combination of composure and nervousness that she found entirely endearing and also alarming because she had not expected to find it endearing. She took the asters. She put them in her water pitcher because she didn't have a vase. "How is the wound?" she asked. "Clean," he said. "Willis changes the dressing every other day the way you showed him." "Good," she said, and then they stood there looking at each other with the awkwardness of two people who have spent 12 days in intense proximity and are now attempting to reconfigure themselves into something that has the correct social shape. "Would you like to walk?" she said. They walked. Harlo was not a large town, but it had a main street with a boardwalk and 3 blocks of enterprises. The general store, the hotel, the saloon, the land office, the blacksmith, and a small church at the end that had been built by the Methodist community and doubled as a schoolhouse. People looked at them. People in small Kansas towns always looked at arrivals, and Albert Holloway arriving to walk with Ellen Hawkins was an arrival worth looking at. Ellen was used to being looked at and had long since stopped caring. Albert appeared to have a similar relationship with scrutiny. They walked to the end of the main street and along the path that ran beside the creek, where the cottonwoods were dropping their last leaves into the water in slow, unhurried spirals. He told her about the fence repairs on the east boundary and the plans he had for a new calving barn he wanted to build before the hard winter. She told him about the baby she had delivered 2 days ago, her 18th, a boy who had been turned wrong and given her a genuine scare before she got him sorted out and his mother calm and both of them healthy. "Were you afraid?" he asked. "During," she said honestly. "Not after. During is different. During I don't have room to be afraid, I just do the next thing." "That's what I've always thought courage was," he said. "Not the absence of fear, just doing the next thing." She looked at him sideways, this rancher who thought about things. "When did you get afraid enough to need that definition?" she asked. He was quiet for a few steps. "When Sarah died," he said. "And then again when I started to think I might want something again. Both of those required doing the next thing." She stopped walking. The creek ran beside them, clear and cold and quick in the October air. "Albert," she said. "I know," he said. "I know the rate you want to go." "It isn't about rate," she said. She struggled to find the words that were true rather than the ones that were simply safe. "I had someone before I came west. He was not a good man. What he did isn't worth describing at length, but it left me with a habit of not trusting the ground to hold." Albert Holloway stood very still while she said this. His expression did not change toward pity, which she had feared, or toward the curious hunger that some men showed when they scented damage in a woman. What it changed toward was something quieter and more serious, a careful, focused attention, the look of a man recalibrating something important. "I'm not him," he said. "I know that," she said. "Knowing it and feeling it are not the same distance apart yet." He nodded slowly. He looked at the creek. What would help close the distance? She had not expected that question. She had expected reassurance, promises, perhaps frustration at the speed of her progress. She had not expected a practical question about what she needed. It undid something in her that she had been holding very tight. "Time," she said when she trusted her voice. "And you doing exactly what you are doing." "I can do that," he said. He came back the next Saturday, and the one after that, and the one after that. November settled over Harlo in stages, first the sharp, bright cold of early autumn, and then the deeper cold that came in off the prairie like a permanent resident taking up its winter quarters. The creek road was still passable but would not be for much longer. He rode it every week. Sometimes she baked, and he stayed for supper at the boarding-house table where she took her meals. Sometimes they walked, bundled now in coats, their breath making small clouds in the cold air. Sometimes she drove out to the ranch for a medical check on a hired hand who'd injured himself, and afterward she sat on the porch with Albert in the thin winter sun, and they talked for hours about nothing important and everything that was. She learned him in pieces. She learned that he had built this ranch not only for himself, but for some idea of continuity, that he had wanted children and had expected to have them. And Sarah's death had closed that door in a way he had never fully reckoned with. She learned that he read, which surprised her until she thought about it, because of course he read. There was the quality of his mind to account for somehow. He had a shelf of books in the front room that included Darwin, which in 1882 Kansas was either brave or careless, and several volumes of American history, and a collection of poetry that he said had belonged to Sarah, but which showed the wear patterns of someone who had read it himself. She learned that he was slow to anger and very clear about the things he would and would not accept in his operations and his relationships, which was not the same as rigidity, but was rather the particular integrity of a man who had thought about who he was. She told him about Robert Farrell. Not all of it, but enough. She told him about the first year in Cincinnati when everything had been fine, and the way the control had come in gradually, so gradually that she had not identified it as control until it was already structured around her life like a cage, and how she had gotten out, and how she was not ashamed of having gotten in, because it had not been weakness that got her in but youth and trust and the desire to be loved. She told him all of this on a Saturday afternoon in November, sitting in the front room of the ranch house by the wood stove, and when she was done, he was quiet for a long moment. "Thank you for trusting me with that," he said. "I am practicing," she said, with the slight smile she had started to allow herself around him. "Practicing what?" "Trusting the ground to hold." He looked at her with something in his face that she had been watching grow for weeks and was now at the point of being undeniable. He reached over and took her hand where it rested on the arm of the chair, not grabbing, not claiming, just his hand over hers, deliberate and careful and warm. She turned her palm up and let his fingers close around hers. They sat that way in front of the wood stove, while the winter light faded at the window and Willis clattered about in the kitchen making supper, and the prairie outside was quiet and enormous and full of space, and Ellen Hawkins sat with her hand held in both of his and felt, for the first time in years, that the ground was holding. He kissed her for the first time in December in the kitchen garden, which was entirely dormant now and would not be growing anything until April, and she had come out to look at it with the practiced eye of someone planning a spring, because she had been doing that planning without quite admitting it to herself, and he had come out behind her and stood beside her in the frozen garden and said, very quietly, "I was thinking you might stay." She had turned to look at him. "Stay how?" she asked. "Stay as in make a life here," he said. "Stay as in be my wife if you would have me. Stay as in I have never been more certain of anything since I drove a stake in this ground 9 years ago and said this is where I am building." The cold was sharp and bright, and their breath came in white clouds. She looked at him in the winter light of the kitchen garden, this man who had been a stranger in a sickroom 12 weeks ago, this man who had stood in a doorway and looked at her as though she were a fixed point, and she felt the old fear rise and she did not step away from it. She stepped toward him and said, "Ask me properly." He took her hands in both of his. "Ellen Hawkins," he said, and the simplicity of his saying her name that way, just her name, no embellishment, landed in her chest like something coming home. "Will you marry me?" "Yes," she said. "I will." He kissed her then, standing in the frozen kitchen garden, and it was a gentle kiss and a certain one, the kind of kiss that knows it has time, and she kissed him back with everything she'd been holding for weeks, and the prairie was cold and wide and full around them, and neither of them minded. They were married in February of 1883, in the small Methodist church at the end of Harlo's Main Street, in a ceremony that was brief and warm, and attended by Willis and Martin Dawson and his wife, and a handful of people from town who had been watching the courtship with the invested interest of people who do not have enough entertainment and have been rooting for the outcome. Ellen wore her best dress, which was blue wool, not white, because she was a practical woman and would wear the dress again. Albert wore his good suit and looked at her when she came down the aisle with an expression that she kept in a private, permanent place in her memory, like a pressed flower between pages. Willis made a supper that was clearly the most ambitious cooking he had ever attempted, and it was delicious, and he looked so pleased with himself over it that both Ellen and Albert took second helpings they didn't entirely need out of affection. They drove back to the ranch in the wagon in the February dark, with blankets over their laps and the stars enormous above them, and the horse knowing the road home without being guided. "Are you afraid?" Albert asked. "No," she said. And for the first time in a very long time, she meant it cleanly and without qualification. She was not afraid. She was home. The first months of their marriage were a revelation. Not because they were without difficulty, because life on a working ranch in Kansas in the 1880s did not offer many days without difficulty, but because the difficulty was shared. That was the revelation. She had forgotten, or perhaps had never fully known, what it felt like to face the hard days with someone beside you. Albert was not a man who wanted her to manage his life or smooth his difficulties away. He wanted her beside him in them, and she found she wanted to be there, that the work of the ranch was interesting to her in ways she had not anticipated, that she had opinions about the calving barn design that turned out to be structurally sound, that she could hold the head of a sick cow with the same steadiness she held a laboring mother, and that Albert looked at her with the same combination of respect and warmth, whether she was in her nurse's clothes tending a hired hand's injury or up to her elbows in the kitchen garden she had claimed as her own. She still rode to Harlo for her patients. Albert never asked her to stop. He had married the whole woman, not a selected portion of her, and the work she did was part of the woman he had married. She was aware that this was not universal among men, that there were husbands in the county who would have required her to put down the medical bag when she picked up the household keys. Albert was not one of those men, and she did not take it for granted. By spring, the kitchen garden was replanted. She kept the flowers along the porch. She kept Sarah's blue curtains in the kitchen window, not out of a sense of obligation to the dead, but because they were beautiful, and because she had come to think of Sarah Holloway not as a shadow over her marriage but as a presence in the house, the woman who had planted the ground before her, who had loved the same man with the same particular intensity, and who deserved to be remembered. She sometimes talked to Sarah in her head when she was in the garden, not because she believed the dead could hear, but because it was a way of honoring continuity. Albert caught her once, kneeling in the garden, clearly having a conversation with no one audible, and his expression was so tender and so careful that she felt no embarrassment about it at all. Summer brought the work and the heat and the long days, and the ranch hummed with it, the cattle and the hands and the constant maintenance of a living operation. One of the hired hands, a young man named Thomas who had come from Ohio, cut his arm badly on a wire fence in July, and Ellen stitched it closed in the ranch kitchen and told him to rest it for a week, which he ignored, and she restitched it the following Wednesday and told him again with more emphasis. And Albert stood in the doorway watching this with an expression of pure amusement that she caught and directed a look at that made him retreat quickly to the barn. She was happy. She was unmistakably, clearly, groundedly happy, in the way that people are happy when they have built something deliberately rather than stumbled into it. There were hard days, and there were days when the isolation of the ranch wore at her, and there were days when she thought about all the people in Harlo and beyond who needed care that she could not reach because the distances were too great. But there was Albert always, in the mornings with his coffee and his conversation, in the evenings by the wood stove, in the bed they shared with the honest, warm, unglamorous intimacy of two people who have chosen each other completely. In September, she began to suspect, and by October she was certain, and she sat down with Albert at the kitchen table on a Tuesday evening and said, without preamble because she had never been a preamble person, "We are going to have a child." Albert Holloway, who was a man who held most things quietly, put down his coffee cup, reached across the table and took both her hands in both of his, and his face did something she had never seen it do before, which was to open entirely without reserve, every careful layer gone, and what was underneath was joy so complete and so naked that her throat tightened with it. "When?" he asked. "May," she said, "if I'm calculating correctly." He stood up. He came around the table to her side and crouched beside her chair and put his forehead against her temple, and they stayed like that in the kitchen with the lamplight around them and the October night outside. And Ellen Holloway thought about all the roads she had taken to get to this table, all the moves and the distances and the grief and the fear and the cold 12-mile ride on a creek road to nurse a stranger, and she thought that all of it, every difficult mile, had been pointing here. The winter was the kind of Kansas winter that tested the structural integrity of everything, buildings and plans and people. 3 weeks of hard freeze in January dropped the temperature to levels that cracked fence posts and killed 2 of the cattle, and kept everyone very close to the fires. Ellen, by then clearly showing the pregnancy, managed her medical calls with more caution and less frequency, which she found difficult because the stillness felt both necessary and wrong, and Albert managed her restlessness with a patience that she did not entirely deserve and was entirely grateful for. She delivered 1 baby during the freeze, the wife of the blacksmith, who had not timed this well. She was gone for 2 days, staying over in Harlo because the temperature was too low to make the return ride safely. Albert did not say anything about this when she came home except to take her coat and press a cup of hot coffee into her hands and ask if both mother and child were well, and when she said yes, both doing fine, it's a girl, he kissed her forehead and went to see to her horse. She sat down with her coffee and thought, not for the first time, that love in practice looked nothing like it did in books. Books gave you grand gestures and declarations. Life gave you a man who took your coat and asked after the mother and the baby and went to see to your horse, and the grandness was all in the consistency of it, the day after day accumulation of someone choosing to be that kind of man. In February, Willis came down with a chest ailment that worried Ellen more than she showed him. He was 63 years old and had the respiratory history of a man who had worked outdoors in Kansas for 40 years, and the cough that settled into him in February was the deep, persistent kind that she knew could go several directions. She treated him aggressively, which Willis accepted with dignity and a mild running complaint about the smell of the steam treatments, and she sat with him in the evenings while he recovered, and he told her stories about Albert as a young man, just starting out on the ranch, and the stories were both funny and illuminating in the way that stories about people told by those who love them always are. He never talked about himself, Willis said. From the very beginning, never talked about himself. But he listened to everyone. I thought when Mrs. Holloway died that he might close up entirely, thought he might turn into one of those men. Willis paused, coughed, accepted the handkerchief Ellen pressed into his hand. He didn't, but it was close, and then you came. I came to nurse him, Ellen said automatically. Willis gave her a look of great patience. Yes, ma'am, he said. Willis recovered fully by March, which was a relief. The chest ailment cleared and his color came back and he resumed his normal patterns, and Ellen, whose professional worry had been genuine, found herself deeply glad in a way that made her understand how completely this place had become hers. Not just Albert, the whole of it. Willis and the ranch and the garden and the hands and the land that ran to the horizon in every direction. The baby came on the 16th of May, 1884. It was a long labor, which Ellen had known it might be, and she had the presence of mind 3 weeks earlier to make arrangements with a woman in Harlo named Mrs. Abbott, who had midwife experience, to come out to the ranch when the time came. Mrs. Abbott came, and Albert sat in the kitchen in a state of controlled agitation that Willis managed with coffee and conversation. And by noon of the 16th the baby was in the world, loud and healthy and immediately opinionated, and he was a boy, and Albert came in when Mrs. Abbott called him and stood at the side of the bed looking at his wife and his son with an expression that Ellen was not going to attempt to put into words because she was tired and happy and the words didn't exist. He needs a name, she said. Yes, Albert said, not looking away from her face. Albert, she said. That's my name, he said. I know, she said. Albert James for your father. He sat down on the edge of the bed beside her and looked at the baby, who had stopped crying and was doing the particular focused studying that newborns do when they are taking inventory of this new situation they have found themselves in. He put one careful finger in the baby's fist, and the baby held it with the powerful, automatic grip of the very new. Albert Holloway, who was not a man who showed what he felt easily or often, pressed his eyes closed for just a moment, and Ellen saw him swallow hard. Albert James, he said quietly. Is that all right? She asked. It's perfect, he said, and opened his eyes and looked at her, and she had thought he had run out of ways to look at her that she had not already catalogued and filed, but this one was new. This was the face of a man holding in his hands everything he had been afraid to want. Albert James Holloway was a good baby in the specific sense that he was extremely clear about his needs and not inclined to be ambiguous. He ate with enthusiasm and grew with the same single-minded purposefulness that appeared to be a family trait. And by July, he was large enough that Willis referred to him as the boss, which stuck. And Ellen told Albert that this was entirely his fault for how he'd run the ranch before the baby learned any different standards. Life on the ranch found its new shape around the baby, with the same practical adaptability that it found around every new challenge, because that was what life on a working frontier ranch required. Ellen continued her medical work, adjusting her schedule around feeding and the specific dependency of a nursing infant, and Albert adjusted his schedule around hers with the same ease that characterized everything between them. There were hard days and there were sleepless nights, and there were days when the prairie winter howled outside, and the baby was fussy and the wood ran low, and she found herself short-tempered in ways she was not proud of, and Albert absorbed all of it without complaint and gave it back to her as patience. She told him once, on one of those hard days, that she was sorry she was difficult. He looked at her with an expression of genuine puzzlement. "You are not difficult," he said. "I have been sharp-tempered all week," she said. "You have been tired," he said. "Those are not the same thing." She looked at him. "How are you so sensible?" she said. He thought about it. "I have had things to teach me," he said. She understood that he meant Sarah, and he meant the years after Sarah, and he meant the long, hard work of grieving and healing and becoming someone who could receive happiness without flinching. She reached up and put her hand against his jaw, and he turned his face into her palm and closed his eyes briefly, the way he sometimes did when he let himself feel something fully. "I love you," she said. "I love you," he said, and it was so simple and so certain that it needed nothing added to it. The following spring brought a dry May and a hot June, and the kind of anxiety that came with drought conditions that every rancher in the county watched with a vigilance that was half practical and half prayer. The creek dropped to half its normal level by the end of June, and Albert made water management decisions with a careful, methodical intelligence that Ellen watched with admiration, watching him absorb the technical problem and solve it piece by piece, moving cattle to the sections with the best grass access, negotiating with a neighboring rancher named Caldwell about shared water rights on the eastern property line. The negotiation with Caldwell was tense. Caldwell was a man who had built his operation with an aggressive territorial approach and who viewed water rights as a zero-sum proposition, and the two men had a history of disagreement on the boundary that predated Ellen's arrival. She heard one of those disagreements in the yard one afternoon when Caldwell came out to the ranch, and the conversation at the gate had the particular quality of two men holding their anger on a tight leash. She brought water out to Albert after Caldwell had ridden away. He was standing at the gate looking after the departing figure with his jaw set and his hands loose at his sides, which she had come to understand was his version of being very angry. "What happened?" she asked. "He wants to run a fence across the section that has always been open access to the creek," Albert said. "It would cut my southern herd's water access by a third. Can he do that legally?" "He can try," Albert said. "The land office records are not as clear as they should be on that boundary." "Then we go to the land office," she said. He looked at her. "It could become a significant dispute." "It already is a significant dispute," she said. "The question is whether you address it through the correct channels before he does something that's harder to undo." He looked at her for a moment, this wife of his who cut through to the practical center of things, and the jaw set released and his expression shifted into something that was partly amusement and partly appreciation and partly love. "You're right," he said. "I know," she said. "The water is cold. Drink it." They went to the land office together the following week. The records, once properly surveyed and examined, were clear in Albert's favor, and a formal notice was served to Caldwell establishing the boundary. Caldwell was angry about it for the rest of the summer, which manifested in cold greetings at the general store and a pointed absence from the County Cattle Association meeting in August. Albert absorbed all of this with the unruffled composure of a man who has done the right thing through the right process and has nothing to defend. And by October the situation had settled into an uneasy but stable peace. Albert James, whom everyone by now called James or the boss depending on their degree of formality, was walking by October and had opinions about everything, including the chickens, whom he regarded with a complicated mixture of fascination and distrust that kept everyone entertained. He had his father's eyes and his mother's directness and Willis's heart, because Willis had become in all practical senses his grandfather, the old man's face changing entirely in the child's presence into something soft and delighted that Ellen loved him for. Christmas of 1884 was the first Christmas Ellen had spent in a house that felt fully like her own since she was 15 years old, and her mother had died, and the household had lost its center. She decorated the house with dried flowers from the garden and pine boughs that Albert brought back from the draw where the few trees grew tall enough to have branches worth cutting, and she baked the way her mother had baked, the Cincinnati recipes that she had carried in her memory across 1,000 miles of prairie. And on Christmas morning James sat in the middle of the parlor floor, surrounded by the simple toys Willis had carved for him, and was so overwhelmed with happiness that he sat very still for several minutes just looking at everything. And Ellen sat next to him on the floor and looked at him, and understood what people meant when they said their heart was full. Albert sat down on the floor next to both of them, which was not dignified for a man of his height, and James immediately climbed onto him with the proprietary confidence of a child who owns his father, and Albert looked at Ellen over the boy's head with an expression that was entirely private and entirely hers. She put her head on his shoulder. Outside the prairie was white with the first real snow of winter, and inside the fire was warm, and the blue flour sack curtains hung in the kitchen window, and the wild aster she had dried in October stood in a jar on the windowsill, and the house was full of the particular quality of life that happens when people choose each other and choose a place and commit to both, root and branch. The years that followed were full ones. The ranch grew and changed with the rhythms of the land and the market, through years that were hard and years that were generous, through a second drought in 1886 that tested everyone in the county, through the severe winter of 1886 into 1887 that devastated many cattle operations across the plains and hit the Holloway Ranch with losses that were significant but survivable, because Albert had made decisions in the years before that built reserves, and because Ellen had, in her practical way, begun keeping accounts that were more conservative than the general optimism of expansion, and because they faced it together, every piece of it, talking through the decisions at the kitchen table late, into the nights while James slept. Through it all, Ellen continued her medical work, which changed and grew as she did, as her skills deepened with experience and as the territory around Harlo changed with the steady arrival of settlers who needed care. She delivered babies and set bones and managed fever, and made the long rides that sometimes scared her and sometimes exhausted her, and always felt like the truest expression of the thing she had been put in the world to do. She saved lives and she lost lives, because medicine in 1882 Kansas was not yet in a position to save every life, and she learned to carry the losses the way she had learned to carry grief, not by setting it down, but by integrating it into the person she was and letting it make her more precise and more careful. In the spring of 1887, James got sick. It was a fever, the kind that came and went in children, and in the first 2 days it was not alarming, and by the third day it was alarming, and by the fourth day Ellen was sitting beside her son's cot at 3 in the morning running through every decision she had made with the cold, methodical terror of a mother who is also a nurse, and therefore cannot escape understanding exactly what might happen. Albert sat on the other side of the cot. They had been there all night. "He's going to be all right," Albert said. "You can't know that," she said. "No," he said, "but I believe it." She looked at him across their son's small, flushed face. "That's not medicine," she said. "No," he agreed. "It isn't, but you have medicine. I'll take faith. Between us we have coverage." She almost laughed. In the dark, in the fear, with her hands folded around her son's small wrist, she almost laughed and felt the terror ease slightly around the edges, because that was what he did, that was what this man did. He found the place where she was rigid with fear and placed himself beside it without pretending it away, and the beside was enough. The fever broke on the 5th day. James was back on his feet and expressing opinions about the chickens within the week. Ellen sat in the kitchen afterward and cried in the particular way that people cry when the danger is past and the body finally releases what it has been holding. Albert sat beside her and said nothing and put his arm around her, and she cried into his shoulder, and he held her steady while she did. By 1888, James was 4 years old and running the ranch operations in his own imagination, which sometimes had to be managed carefully when it intersected with the actual ranch operations, and Ellen was expecting again. This second pregnancy she wore with a certain ease, not because it was easier physiologically, but because she knew herself and her body better, and she knew the house and the life around her were solid and held. She told Albert in the kitchen again, on a Tuesday evening again, because apparently that was when revelations happened in their household. "Another one," she said. Albert's face did the opening thing again, the same thing it had done 4 years ago, the complete removal of every careful layer. "When?" He said. "November," she said. "And before you say anything, I am going to keep working until I can't." "I wasn't going to say anything," he said. "You were going to have a thought about it." "I was going to have a thought," he admitted, "but I was not going to say it." She looked at him fondly. "What was the thought?" "That you are the most capable person I have ever met," he said, "and that I would like to wrap you in cotton wool for 6 months, simultaneously." "Those thoughts are in conflict," she said. "They are," he said. "I have resolved them in your favor." She reached across the table and took his hand. "Good," she said. The baby was born in November of 1888, on a Sunday, and this time the labor was shorter, and Mrs. Abbott was there again with her calm competence, and when the baby arrived it was a girl. A red-faced, furious, magnificently loud girl who made her opinions about the exterior world immediately and comprehensively clear. James, who had been prepared for this new development by months of explanation and had been deeply skeptical, came in to see his new sister with the caution of a person approaching something unpredictable, examined her carefully from a safe distance of about 3 feet, and announced that she was smaller than he expected. "She will grow," Albert told him. "I know," James said. He moved slightly closer, examining the baby with narrowed eyes. "What is her name?" Ellen looked at Albert. "Clara," she said. After her sister in Cincinnati, who had received many letters over the years and not enough visits. Clara Hawkins, who had read every word of every letter from Kansas and written back with the particular understanding of a woman who loved her sister enough to let her be exactly who she was. "Clara," Albert said. He looked at the baby. "Hello, Clara." Clara Holloway appeared to be assessing him in return. James eventually moved close enough to touch the baby's hand, which grabbed his finger with the same powerful infant grip that he himself had demonstrated 4 years ago, and his face changed entirely in a way that made both his parents understand that whatever skepticism he had felt about the new arrival was finished. "She is strong," James said, with considerable respect. "She is," Ellen agreed. The years after Clara's birth were the full, layered, ordinary, extraordinary years of a family in the middle of a life they had built together. James grew tall and serious and intensely curious about everything, the kind of child who asked questions until he reached the bottom of an adult's knowledge and then looked thoughtful about what he'd found there. Clara grew into exactly the person her first 5 minutes had suggested she would be, opinionated and vigorous and absolutely certain of her own position in any room she occupied, and also deeply tender in ways that she preferred not to make obvious but that were visible to anyone who was paying attention. Albert ran the ranch with the same quiet, intelligent dedication he had always applied to it, and as the decade turned and the 1890s began to take shape, he began to see the ways the cattle business was changing, the push and pull of market forces and railroad access, and the increasing pressure of settlement that was transforming the open range into something more bounded and defined. He adapted. He had always adapted. He diversified the operation in ways that made Willis nod approvingly, and made the less flexible ranchers in the county watch with the cautious interest of people who suspect someone else has seen something they missed. Ellen's work changed too. The town of Harlo grew through the decade, slowly but steadily, and the need for medical care grew with it. In 1891, she made the acquaintance of a young doctor named Franklin who had come from Kansas City, fresh out of his training, and established a small practice in Harlo. He was 24 and earnest and well-trained and somewhat overwhelmed by the realities of frontier practice. And Ellen Holloway, who had been doing this work for a decade by then, became both his colleague and, in the practical sense of the word, his teacher. Franklin was respectful of her knowledge in a way that she appreciated, and not inclined to the kind of reflexive male dismissal of female expertise that she had encountered throughout her career. They worked cases together, consulted on difficult situations, and built a professional relationship that made both of them more effective than they would have been separately. Franklin delivered his first baby with Ellen's instruction and guidance, and afterward sat down on the nearest chair with his hands shaking in the particular way of someone who has just participated in something that outstrips their theoretical preparation, and Ellen gave him the same dry comfort she had given herself a decade ago. You did the next thing, and the next thing worked. In 1892, Willis died. He died on a Sunday morning in March, quietly in his own bed, with the particular dignity of a man who has managed everything about his life with that same quality of careful self-possession. He had been declining since November. The old chest ailment returned and deeper this time, and Ellen had known since January that this was the direction it was going, and she had managed his comfort and his care with everything she knew, and with the additional resource of simply loving him, which she had come to understand, was its own form of medicine. Albert sat with him through the last night. James, who was 8 years old and understood death in the clear-eyed way that children on farms do, sat with them for a while, and then went to bed when Albert told him to and lay awake listening, the way children do when they know something important is happening and cannot participate. Clara, who was 3 and did not fully understand, but understood that something was very wrong, stayed close to Ellen all evening and fell asleep in her arms. In the morning Ellen made breakfast and they sat at the kitchen table, all 4 of them, in the particular quiet of a house that has lost someone. James ate carefully and said nothing. Clara watched her parents' faces and copied their quietness with the serious attention of a small person learning how to navigate grief. Willis would have had something sensible to say, Albert said finally. He always did, Ellen agreed. He told me once, Albert said, when I was very young, still starting out here, that the land doesn't care about your plans. He said you have to make your plans and then hold them loosely because the land is going to have its own ideas. I thought he meant it practically. He meant it every way, Ellen said. Albert nodded. He looked at the kitchen window, at the blue curtains there, at the March light coming through them, pale and cold, and full of the particular character of early spring, not yet warm but unambiguously moving in that direction. He buried Willis in the pasture ground behind the barn, under the cottonwood that was the oldest tree on the property, and he said a few words that were simple and true and sufficient, and James stood very straight beside his father and Clara stood very straight beside her mother, and the sky was vast above them and the land held them all. Time moved. the way time does in lives that are genuinely lived. The children grew. The ranch changed and survived and grew alongside the changes in the territory. And Kansas in the late 1890s was a different place than the Kansas of 1882. More settled, more structured. The wildest edges of the frontier pushed further back. The railroads and the telegraph and the slow accumulation of civilization making the world both smaller and more connected. Ellen was 40 in 1894, and she met the fact of it with the same undeflected practicality she brought to most things. Albert told her she looked exactly the same as she had the first day he saw her, which she knew was not strictly true and was entirely true in the way he meant it, and she told him he was biased, and he said yes, thoroughly and unrepentantly, and she laughed and he laughed and James rolled his eyes with the complete dignity of a 10-year-old who has seen his parents being ridiculous before. They had one more child. A boy born in 1895, when Ellen was 41 and had not expected it and was at first stunned and then deeply, quietly glad. He was born in August, in the warm lamplight of the house that had been built in stages, and he was a strong, easy baby who slept more than James or Clara had, and seemed from the very beginning to be a person with tremendous internal resources. They named him Henry, for no ancestor in particular, but because it was a solid name that suited him. James at 11 held his new brother with the kind of careful, proprietary love of an older sibling, who has been through this before and knows himself to be capable of it. Clara at 6 held him with the passionate, absolute intensity of a small person who has just found something she plans to love completely and forever, and was, from that day forward, Henry's most dedicated champion in every situation life brought to him. In the spring of 1898, James was 14 and beginning to be, in the way of 14-year-olds, something more than a child and not yet a man, asking the questions that the in-between age asks and wanting answers that were real. He asked his father one evening what he had been afraid of when he was young, and Albert, who had always given his son honest answers, told him about the years after Sarah's death and the long, close silence of a man afraid to want anything. James listened with the same careful attention he had always had. Then he said, "And then what happened?" "Your mother came," Albert said. James considered this for a moment. "To nurse you," he said. "Yes," Albert said. "And then she stayed." "Eventually," Albert said, "I had to convince her." James looked at his father with an expression that combined skepticism and warmth in proportions that were purely his mother's. "How?" he asked. Albert smiled. "I told her she was worth the ride," he said. James's expression shifted to puzzlement. "That's all." "That was enough," Albert said. "When you find the right person, the right thing is usually enough. The trick is knowing what to say." James filed this away with the characteristic Holloway thoroughness, under things to think about at length. It was not the last conversation about it. Life on the ranch gave many opportunities for the kind of conversation that happens in the margins of work, in the evening quiet, in the particular leisure of a Sunday afternoon when the immediate demands have been met, and there is space for the larger questions. Albert and Ellen both talked to their children about the things that mattered, not in formal pronouncements, but in the ongoing way of people who believe that understanding is built piece by piece, in small moments, over time. They talked about the injustices of the world their children were growing into, because those were real and could not be honestly ignored. Willis, who had been born enslaved before the war and had made his way west through the years after, had been part of their lives for years, and his history was not something they set aside. Albert had listened to Willis's stories with the same quality of attention he brought to everything important, and he had raised his children to listen the same way, to understand that the freedom Willis had built for himself had come through decades of courage and work in a world that had tried to deny him his full humanity, and that this was not a distant or abstract injustice, but a living history that required acknowledgement and response. The world was imperfect, and the frontier was imperfect, and the country was imperfect. Ellen, who had come to Kansas in part because the freedom of the frontier promised more space for who she was than the constrained world she had left, understood both the promise and its limitations. She and Albert talked about these things with the kind of honesty that came from two people who trusted each other enough not to perform. By the turn of the century, the ranch was an established, successful operation, one of the better-regarded enterprises in Caldwell County, and the Holloways were a family known in the community for their stability and their competence, and for the particular quality of openness that both Albert and Ellen carried. People came to them with practical problems and occasionally with the other kind, and they were received with the same thoughtful attention. James, at 16, was beginning to show the shape of the man he would become, tall like his father and direct like his mother, with the additional quality of a reflective seriousness that seemed entirely his own. He had opinions about the ranch and expressed them, which Albert encouraged with the conviction that the next generation of an enterprise should be building on it rather than simply inheriting it. He also had, by now, a clear interest in books and ideas and the larger world beyond the ranch and the county, which Ellen recognized with a complex maternal pride as the sign of a mind that needed more room than the immediate horizon offered. Clara, at 12, was already the most organized person in the household, which she managed with great efficiency, and not a trace of self-consciousness about it. She had taken over the kitchen garden with the complete confidence of someone who has always known it was theirs, and she had expanded it, and she had opinions about what should be planted where that were informed and correct, and she argued them with anyone who disagreed, including her father, who was the only person who could engage her in a gardening debate that lasted longer than 5 minutes. Henry, at 5, was a quiet, observant child who missed nothing and said little, and was learning that these were in fact significant advantages in a household with his siblings. He followed Albert around the ranch with the focused attention of someone filing everything away for later use, and Albert let him, explaining things as he went in the same patient way that Willis had once explained things to a young rancher starting out, understanding that this was how knowledge was transmitted, one generation showing the next, out in the field where the work was. One afternoon in the fall of 1900, Albert found Ellen in the kitchen garden, which she still tended when the season allowed, kneeling in the turned earth in the October light. She was 46 years old and she had lived on this ranch for 18 years, and the garden was showing the evidence of a person who understood it deeply, every bed placed and planted with the accumulated knowledge of 2 decades of Kansas soil and weather. He sat down on the porch steps and watched her. She knew he was there. She kept working, her hands moving through the dirt with the ease of long practice, and the late afternoon light was long and gold over the pasture and the cottonwoods and the house with its covered porch and its blue curtains in the kitchen window. After a while she sat back on her heels and looked at him. "What are you thinking?" she asked. "I'm thinking about the first time I stood in this doorway and you told me to go back to bed," he said. She smiled, the full, unguarded smile that she had reserved for him since before she would admit to herself that she was doing it. And I was thinking that of all the decisions I've made for this ranch and this land," he said, "nothing I ever decided was as right as standing in that doorway and refusing to stay where I was told." She stood up. She brushed the dirt from her hands and walked to the porch steps and sat down beside him, close, their shoulders touching in the familiar way of people who have been alongside each other for 18 years. "You were supposed to be in bed," she said. "I know," he said, "but you were standing there in the lamplight looking at me like I was already gone, and I was not gone, and I needed you to know that." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the garden she had planted and replanted over all these years, at the flowers along the porch that she had kept going in every season they could grow, at the land that ran away to the horizon in the last gold of the October day. "I knew even then," she said. "Standing in that hallway, I knew." "What did you know?" that I wasn't going to be able to leave you and mean it, she said. I told myself I was going to Harlo and staying there. I told myself it was medical obligation, but I knew. He put his arm around her. She leaned into his side, her head against his shoulder. 18 years, he said. 18 years, she agreed. More to go, he said. Considerably more, she said. The evening settled around them, the sky going first gold and then rose, and then the deep, particular blue of Kansas autumn. The same blue it had been in October of 1882, when a woman from Cincinnati had ridden a creek road to nurse a stranger and found instead the whole shape of her life. Stars appeared, first one and then many, the enormous prairie sky doing what it always did, opening up above them with that quality of space and depth that had brought both of them west in the first place, that had always been the truest thing about this land. Inside the house, Clara was making supper with the competent authority of a 12-year-old who had decided this was her domain, and James was at the table with his books, and Henry was underfoot in the kitchen being managed with cheerful firmness by his sister, and the sounds of all of it came through the kitchen window, domestic and warm and alive. Albert Holloway sat on the porch of the house he had built in stages with his wife beside him and his children inside, and the land he had chosen running away to the horizon in every direction. And he held the sum of it the way you hold something you know is precious, carefully, with full attention, without taking the weight of it for granted. Ellen Hawkins Holloway sat beside the man who had stood in a doorway 18 years ago and refused to stay where he was told, who had ridden 12 miles every Saturday through a Kansas November to court her properly, who had taken her hands in a frozen kitchen garden and asked her simply and without embellishment to make a life with him. And she thought about all the distances she had traveled to find her way to this porch, all the things she had shed and all the things she had kept, all the choices that had pointed, in the end, toward this. She had come to nurse a stranger. She had found the rancher standing in the doorway long after. And in the long after, which was every ordinary and extraordinary day that followed, which was 18 years of mornings and winters and gardens and children and grief and laughter, and the steady, deep-rooted certainty of two people who had chosen each other with full knowledge of what choosing meant, she had found the thing that she had not quite known she was looking for. She had found the ground that held. The stars multiplied above them. The October night came on, cool and clear and full. Inside, Clara announced supper. James called that he was coming. Henry's small feet ran across the kitchen floor with the particular percussion of a 5-year-old who moves at full speed between points A and B without exception. Albert pressed his lips to Ellen's temple. "Ready?" he said. She stood up. She held out her hand to him and he took it. "Ready," she said. And they walked inside together, into the warmth and the noise and the particular beautiful disorder of the life they had built. And the door closed behind them on the October night, and the stars kept on above the Kansas prairie, and the creek road wound east through the cottonwoods toward a town and a world that had been changed, slightly but permanently, by the choice two people made to stand in a doorway and refuse to stay where they were told. The blue curtains hung in the kitchen window. The flowers would come back in spring. They always did.